الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Alhamdulillah, we have been receiving a good response to the pamphlet. Has everybody received it in their home? Yes, Alhamdulillah. So a lot of non-Muslims have been calling and asking questions about Islam and emailing us. And of course, we got a couple of angry emails. You guys want to convert us to Christianity and, to Islam and force Sharia on us, so on and so forth. But I think this, inshallah, this is the beginning, because we have been receiving also calls and emails from other places, other masajid in the country, and also from California. They said they wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to get our pamphlet and print it and distribute it under their name. So this means they like the idea. And I think this is the largest da'wah project ever, and I don't think any organization or any city or any country ever distributed 1 million pamphlets to people's homes. This is the largest one, in my opinion. So before we talk about da'wah and the different types of da'wah, so there's da'wah to Muslims, to non-Muslims, to new Muslims. Before we make da'wah to non-Muslims, and this is what we'll talk about next time, inshallah, you have to understand the history of the stereotypes against Islam and Muslims. So why is Islam vilified in the media? Why do they attack Islam in the media all the time? Of course, I'm going to give you 8 different reasons tonight why some in the media, especially conservatives, attack Islam and Muslims. Of course, some of these reasons are based on facts, but some are nothing more than conspiracy theories. Okay. Some of them are realistic, some are not. Of course, the first one is a realistic one. So, the history factor. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ lived in the 7th century, and by the time the Prophet ﷺ passed away, most of Arabia had already accepted Islam. So why did Islam spread to neighboring countries, like here in Asia and here in Africa? Because to some people, there's one explanation for this, that Islam was spread by the sword. Okay, to start with, at that time, back around the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were 2 major empires. The Persian Empire, Iran, around here, and they occupied some of the territories here in Yemen and other places. And of course, the Roman Empire, which dominated most of North Africa and Syria, Palestine, and all these places. So, when Arabia accepted Islam, of course, most of these tribes, they used to pay taxes to Persia and to Rome. So when these tribes or cities accepted Islam, they started to pay daraib or taxes to Persia and to Iran, and this meant one thing to them: war. If you don't pay me taxes, I will fight you. Of course, these Muslim tribes have to be defended by the early Muslim state, and this is why the Prophet ﷺ prepared the army of Usama, and the Prophet ﷺ passed away before the army was sent. And every time the Persian and the Roman troops were defeated, they retreated and they started to mobilize another army, and Muslims had to attack again, and so on and so forth. And they drove them out of North Africa and from that area. So most of these wars were defensive on the side of the Muslims. Of course, most of these countries, including Egypt, they welcomed Muslims for different reasons. Number one, the Romans, for example, were collecting a lot of taxes from the people, so they burdened the native people of these countries. And in Egypt, for example, before the coming of Amr ibn al-As, the Romans who collected about 26 different types of taxes. There was this tax they called the death tax. If someone dies in your family, you have to pay a big tax before you are able to bury that person. So when Muslims came, of course, the natives of Egypt and other places, they supported the Muslim army, and they fought with them. And this is what historians say, that Egyptians and most of North Africans, they fought with Muslims Muslims against the Romans. Also, the people in North Africa, they knew that Muslims were muwahhideen. They believed in one God, like most of the population in North Africa. But the Romans were Trinitarians. They believed in three gods, and they were forcing this by the sword. You probably heard about the followers of Arianism. So Arius was a bishop from Libya, and he was stationed in Alexandria, and he was the highest bishop at that time. And he was teaching this belief that there's only one God. Isa alayhi salam was a prophet, and so on and so forth. So Rome didn't like this, and they fought and they killed hundreds of thousands of Arians in that area. You can Google them. Arianism. Arius, the followers of Arius. So this is another reason why the Egyptians, for example, fought alongside with Amr ibn al-As and the Muslim army against the Romans. When did Egypt become a Muslim country? How many years after Amr ibn al-As and the Muslim army arrived in Egypt? How many years? Anyone? 300 years. So if Islam was spread by the sword, why in the world it took Muslims 300 years to convert the people of Egypt to Islam? This didn't happen. The people accepted Islam willingly. Of course, we might talk about the jizya, why Muslims were collecting jizya from the people. Okay, to start with, everybody in the world throughout history paid taxes. We pay taxes, okay, in this country. So Muslims and non-Muslims pay taxes. The Muslims paid taxes in the form of zakat. Non-Muslims paid taxes in the form of jizya. And the jizya was collected based on the income, and it was on average 2 dirham on every person. So if you make, for example, $60,000 in Canadian money, then you could pay about $300 in jizya. And this is what paid. So most of the time, the jizya was much less than the zakat that Muslims paid. And of course, they say that more than 65% of non-Muslims didn't pay jizya because women didn't pay, the elderly didn't pay, the old and the elderly didn't pay, those who were not able to work, the children, they didn't pay jizya. Non-Muslims who joined the Muslim army to defend these countries against the Persians and the Romans didn't pay jizya. Muslims who didn't join the army to fight against the Romans and the Persians had to pay the jizya. So it has to be understood in this way. The jizya was paid at the time of Dawood alayhi salam, and it was paid during the time of Isa alayhi salam. You read in the Bible where when the Jews came to Isa alayhi salam asking, should we continue paying the jizya to Caesar? So he said, pay to God or give to God what is God's and give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give zakat to Allah and give jizya to Caesar. So that was used around that time. Islam was seen as the only, or has been seen as the only threat to Christendom in Europe. Why? Number one, because Islam was unmatched in terms of its organization and rapid spread and vigor. And number two, because of the close vicinity of the Muslim world. Here is the Muslim world at that time, and here is Europe. China was a little bit far away. India was far away and weak at that time, so they didn't constitute a threat to Europe. So Islam was always seen as a threat, and they see the rapid Islam in North Africa, in Asia, and also some Europeans also accepted Islam. Based on this understanding that Muslims and Europeans and Christians have always fought wars, like the Crusades. Of course, Muslims pushed back during the time of the Ottomans, and they reached the gates of Vienna, the heart of Europe, in the 12th century. The Europeans pushed back, and they invaded almost all Muslim countries in the past 300 or 400 years. Of course, the creation of the State of Israel here, and so on and so forth. The betrayal of Muslim countries in World War I, 1914, almost all Muslim countries supported the Allies. So when the Ottoman Empire is defeated with the support of Muslim countries, then European countries will give independence to Muslim countries. But this didn't happen. Right after the war, France and Britain, they sat in Iraq somewhere and they divided almost all Muslim countries among themselves. They call it the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So they betrayed Muslims and they stabbed them in the back. So this is how Muslims look at it. So based on this idea, some people like Bernard Lewis Huntington, of course they wrote about the clash of civilization. If conflict dominated the history of Muslims and Europe, then most likely the future will be the same. So Muslims in the Muslim world and Europeans and of course America, they will continue fighting in the future. They will have to fight for domination. The second one is the world domination. And conservatives always talk about Islam dominating the world in two ways. Number one, the first one is the military jihad, the Osama bin Laden style. Attacking people and using military force to attack people in the West, using planes and so on and so forth. And of course, they use some Muslims, like Andrew Choudhury in London. He's a very hardliner activist. He always talks in the news. They invite him all the time on Fox News and other conservative media, and he says it very clearly. You know what? The flag of Islam will fly over the White House one day, and we will dominate the West, convert everyone to Islam, and Islam will dominate, and Sharia will apply. He says it very clearly. And of course, he quotes a lot of verses from the Quran. You can quote any verses from the Quran to support anything you want. Of course, people are scared to death when they hear this. The second one is the stealth jihad, and they talk about this all the time. What does stealth jihad mean? Stealth jihad means to convert people to Islam with a smile. For example, sending out a million pamphlets to people's homes. To them, this is converting people to Islam. Of course, Muslim organizations, Islamic centers, their role in the West is to convert people to Islam stealthily. So this is number one. The other one, so Muslims basically are a fifth column. They try to convert people to Islam and to infiltrate the society, to convert it to Islam from within. The military jihad intends to convert people to Islam by force from without, from the outside. So this is the first one of the stealth jihad, the Muslim organizations, the Islamic centers. The second one is the birth rates. So Muslims make a lot of babies. So if you speak about the Egyptian family, average 3-4 kids, Lebanese 6-7 kids, Somalis 17 kids. Yeah, this is how they think. This is how they think. So Muslims try to convert the West stealthily, knowing that Westerners don't get married and they don't make babies because they just enjoy their lives. In France, for example, studies show that 1 out of 18 gets married. Just 1 out of 18. The 17, they just, the boyfriend, girlfriend stuff. So they don't make babies, and they say it has reached a stage where it is irreversible. Even if Westerners start to make more babies, they cannot counter the Muslim spread in the West. So this spread through birth rates will shift the population in the West to Islam within 30 to 40 years. So this is what they say. Europe and North America will become Muslim colonies in about 50 years. Okay. So this is number 2. Number 3, Muslim immigration. These Muslims are sending their people here through immigration and refugees. Because they have wars in Somalia, they have wars in Lebanon, they have wars here and wars there. So people start coming to the West as refugees or as immigrants. So what should we do? Number 1, we have to tighten immigration laws to disallow Muslims from coming to this country. We allow people from Europe to come, but Muslims, no. And some of them even said we have to kick out some Muslims to send them back where they came from. This is the only way to stop the Muslim stealth jihad. Number three, what they call the vital enemy factor. And this is a very important point. They always talk about it in political strategists in the American foreign policy. They always talk about this point. The big countries like the US and European countries, they have to have enemies to survive. How? Number one, they say that this vital enemy, the enemy in need, has to be used as a uniting mechanism and as a distractive mechanism. Okay, you explain. Uniting mechanism, you use the foreign enemy. Say, for example, Islam is the enemy, that foreign enemy. You can use this to unite your people. You can unite liberals and Democrats, conservatives, and you can also combine or unite Protestants and Catholics, Jews and Christians against that foreign enemy. Otherwise, if you have peace with everyone, then you're going to start to have civil wars inside. The whites are going to start attacking blacks and so on and so forth, Protestants, Catholics, and so on and so forth. And this has been true throughout history. The Roman Empire collapsed basically because they stopped having wars with their neighbors. Then they started to have internal conflicts, and it ended with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Muslims in Spain did the same thing. When Muslims stopped the Futuhat, they started to fight with one another, and Muluk al-Tawa'if, and every street was governed by one of the Muslim rulers. And the rulers started to fight with one another to expand the empires, and eventually it collapsed. So this is the uniting mechanism. Number two, the distractive mechanism. If you always talk about the foreign enemy, then you will distract people's attention from all the social problems you have, economic problems and political problems. Okay, you will always be talking about the scarecrow, that foreign enemy. If you look at the US, for example, this is very true. Just over the past century, the US has changed enemies every 20 years. They have to. Why? They say because you cannot use the same excuses to fight and kill people all the time. You have to change excuses every 20 years. In the 1940s, when Muslims were the Aladdin people, we used to fly with magic lamps and the flying carpets. Back then, we were not the enemies. Back in the 1940s, the enemy was the Nazis from Germany and the fascists from Italy and Japan. That was the enemy back then. 20 years later, in the 1960s, who was the enemy? The Vietnamese. 20 years later, in the 1980s, the communists and the Russians. 20 years later, in the 2000s, the Muslims. 20 years later, maybe the Chinese, maybe the Canadians, nobody knows. So it has to be someone else or someone different all the time. You cannot have the same enemy forever. Of course, the 9/11 factor. When the US was attacked in September 11, 2001, and that was the biggest attack on American soil throughout its history. Of course, people were afraid and people were angry, and there were a lot of questions in people's minds about Islam and Muslims. And one of the biggest mistakes they did in the media, they didn't invite Muslims to speak about Islam and Muslims, and Fox News still does the same thing till today. So who will they invite to speak about Islam and Muslims? They will invite a Christian minister to speak about Islam and Muslim. And this is just like inviting a plumber to speak about pharmacy. Okay? Completely different thing. Even if you speak about Islam and Muslims and you have the best intentions, but you're not Muslims, you're not going to give an accurate representation of Islam and Muslims. For example, there's this movie that was made in 1992. Who's the name of that guy who used to steal money from the rich and give it to the poor? Robin Hood, King of the Thieves. This is the title of the movie. The major character was played by Morgan Freeman and Tom Hanks. It's an excellent movie. made by non-Muslims, it speaks about Islam and Muslims in a very nice way. So the Muslim character, Azim, played by Morgan Freeman, he was very scholarly, very cultural Muslim, compared to the non-Muslims who were shown in the movie. There's only one problem. Azim prayed like a Hindu, like this, not like a Muslim. So they made mistakes when they represented Islam, even when they had good intentions. They also invited a lot of former Muslims to speak about Islam. And of course, if you left something, then you wouldn't have something good to say about it. They invite conservatives and the people who have a history of hatred against Islam and Muslims. Of course, people also talk about the oil factor. That the reason behind stereotyping Islam and Muslims and bashing Islam and demonizing Muslims is all about the oil. It's a smoke screen. And this was captured by a famous cartoon back in 2002. It says here, they show Bush, and he says, we have 710 good reasons to be involved in the affairs of the Middle East. So his assistant said, excuse me, Mr. President, the sign is upside down. So when they turn it upside down, then it says, we have one good reason to be involved in the affairs of the Middle East. Okay. So the supporters of this reason, they say, okay, there are many countries in Africa, and there are many countries in Latin America. They abuse their people, okay? There are a lot of violations against human rights, but the US doesn't seem to be interested in helping these people. Why you always seem to be interested in the Middle East, in Muslim countries, to spread democracy and freedom, while the same thing is happening in other countries that happen not to have oil, they don't have oil. But we are not interested in helping them because they don't have no oil, okay? So this is the reason. Others say that it always boils down to the petrodollar. What is the petrodollar? That all countries in the world have to sell their oil with the American dollars, for the American dollars. If any country, like Iran, or like Libya, Gaddafi wanted to sell his oil for gold. Saddam Hussein wanted to sell his gold for euros. And Ahmadinejad still wants to sell his oil for anything except the American dollar. So this is why America is picking on them, because once you shift, you change the medium of exchange to euro or anything else, the American economy will collapse. It's already in trouble, but it will further damage the American economy. So they have to do anything they can to stop this. Countries in the Muslim world have the majority of the reserves of oil reserves in the world. يعني المسلمين عندهم أكثر احتياط النفط في العالم زي السعودية والعراق والكويت وكذا. So those who are willing to cooperate and give some of their oil to the US willingly, they're good folks. But those who refuse to cooperate, like Iraq and Ahmadinejad and Libya, they are in big trouble. Again, some of these facts, some of these reasons are realistic, some are just conspiracy theories. Number 6, the new conservative factor. So you have Fox News, the Sun News in Canada. They always support Israel, and the scholars say, like Jack Shaheen and what's his name? Edward Said. He's originally Palestinian, but he was Christian, and he was very famous in the US. He passed away a few years ago. He said the reason why they're attacking Islam all the time and show Israel as a victim to create public support in the West for the state of Israel. So this is why they always portray Palestinians as the killers and Muslims as the villains and as the bad people. So this can create a lot of support for the state of Israel. What does Jesus Isa alayhi salam have to do with new conservatism? Okay, very simple. Conservatives believe that if there is a lot of chaos and fighting and wars in the Middle East, this will hasten the second coming of Isa alayhi salam. The more fighting and the more bloodshed in the Middle East or in the Muslim world, the sooner Isa alayhi salam will come back. And there are a lot of people who still have this belief. Bush had that belief, or this is what they say. Also, number 7, the ignorance factor. Recent studies show that most Americans and most people in the West, non-Muslims, they don't have, or actually have little information about Islam. Most of the information they have is through the media. They listen to radio, they watch movies, and they watch the news, and most of the information they get is through the media. Not through direct contact with Muslims, because this is different. So when they get their information from the media, they believe everything the media tells them, even if it is false. في عندنا مثل في العربي اسمه بيقول الإنسان عدو ما يجهل. So this saying in Arabic means that man is the enemy of the unknown. If you don't know something, you're always scared of it. If you don't trust it, you're afraid of it. And this is what happens in the case of the Muslim world. Our biggest problem in the Muslim world is not money or resources. We have everything. Muslims are probably the richest people in the world. Compare Egyptians, for example, to the Japanese. The Japanese are poor, masakin. They don't have anything. We have tourism, we have agriculture, we have industry, we have natural resources. They don't have anything, and they were destroyed in World War II to the ground. But still, they have some of the largest economies in the world. Okay? Tight. Do we invest our money to speak for ourselves in the West and to educate non-Muslims about Islam? Or do we spend our money on Rotana, movie channels, Al-Arabi, singing channels, dancing channels, cooking channels? Okay? This is what we do. Billions of dollars are spent. We have so many Arabic channels that are specialized in movies and singing and dancing and cooking. How many Muslim channels are specialized in da'wah in English? A few. So there is Peace TV, there is Islam TV, but there are few ones, but most of them have financial problems and they are struggling to survive. Okay? And most of them also address Muslim audiences. They are not directed toward non-Muslim audiences. The last point is what they call the ratings factor. The ratings factor, they say in English, if it bleeds, it leads, or blood sells, meaning people are always interested in violence and problems and crime and big problems, okay? If you show in the news good stuff all the time, pleasant situations, this got married, okay, the flowers, beautiful things, nobody is going to watch your channel and you will run out of business. But if they show violence and blood and people dying and people are bleeding and suffering and crime, this is what they will watch. And the more violence you have, the more ratings you will get and the more advertisement you will get, and you will make lots of money. So the people in the media, they understand this. So they always focus on violence and terrorism and Islam and all these things. Number 2, they show people what they are already familiar with and what they are willing to hear. And say, for example, if they start, if all people in the media start talking about how beautiful Islam is and how peaceful Muslims are. For them, this is fairy tales. Nobody is going to believe this. But if they tell them, oh, Islam is violent, Muslims are killers, and so on and so forth, oh, because they are familiar with this stuff, so they will accept it. Okay. So people always accept what they are familiar with. So basically, inshallah, these are the top 8 reasons why Islam is demonized and attacked in the media. If you have any questions, inshallah, you can email me. We'll continue next time, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.